Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight for the week is the formation of the Baptist Foreign Missions Commission on November 24th, 1880. The Reverend W. Colley led 150 fellow African Americans to form the commission at a convention in Montgomery, Alabama. In 2013, the Southern Baptist Convention's International Mission Board named its International Learning Center in Rockville, Virginia, after Colley. Our next historical highlight and the subject of our deep dive is the beginning of the Crusades. As the papacy's influence grew in the Middle Ages and kings and emperors fought for power, Christianity endured many bouts of infighting. Pope Urban II united Christians when he began the Crusades on November 27, 1095 AD. The goal was to rid the Holy Land of Islamic rule. Our final historical highlight for the week is Thomas Becket's crossing of the English Channel. When Henry II was King of England in the 1100s, he began to limit the clergy's power and pull away from Rome and the Pope's influence. He held a conference on 16 articles, known as the Constitutions of Clarendon, that were designed to enact restrictions on the Church. He managed to have all of the English clergy agree, except for Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket hid in France until he crossed the English Channel on November 30th, 1170. 4 weeks later, King Henry's men assassinated Becket. Annual pilgrimages to Becket's grave gave rise to Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Matthew Phillips of Concordia University, Nebraska, about the beginning of the Crusades.
Hello and welcome back again to another episode of This Week in Christian History, and we are focusing on this week of November 24th for our episode to talk about November 27th, 1095, which is the official quote-unquote kickoff day, if you want to, of the Crusades, all of which there will be several from that we'll learn about and talk about a little bit today when Urban II, the Pope, kicks everybody off. And we're glad to have as our guest Dr. Matthew Phillips, who is a professor of history at Concordia in Nebraska. So thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
So in addition to that, I should say, because we are the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College, that you are an alum of this institution and of the history department. So we want to throw that extra little way to go shout out in there.
Yep, 1993.
How about that? So in case Dr. Kirkford is actually listening to an episode, we got two
He might
of his
remember
followers.
me. I hope he does.
He would. That's history. People don't forget stuff, right? I mean, we don't forget those things. So tell us about when we hear about the idea of the Crusades. My guess is people have all kinds of different ideas about what it probably is and what it wasn't. And if they watch some squirrely thing like the Da Vinci Code or something, they get some other ideas about what they think it is, and the Knights Templar and all this kind of stuff to do. So give us some background of kind of what leads up to this particular time of what these Crusades were really, really all about.
Well, there's a couple of elements going on. One is the development in religious devotion in the 11th and into the early 12th century. So that's one factor, because crusading, what we would call crusading, really was part of the pilgrimage culture of religious devotion. So there were pilgrimages, many pilgrimages before any crusading, but crusading comes out of that, and crusading is a part of it is a pilgrimage usually.
Of going to the Holy Land. I mean,
either the Holy Land,
not just the Canterbury Tales, right?
It could be anywhere. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So most people are familiar with the Canterbury Tales. That was a pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket, right? So, which I highly recommend going to Canterbury if you get a chance.
Absolutely. Well, that's a podcast episode we
Oh,
have
okay.
that's coming up at the end of December, but that's
Nice.
okay. Keep going.
Yes. And so, yes, it was part of that, but it was also what we'll refer to as the Crusades, because nobody called them the Crusades until really modern times. Now, it comes from the idea because they used the sign of the cross, and later they used to call them in Latin, somebody signed by the cross. And the French term croisade is where we get later crusade. But even a book written in the 17th century in English about the Crusades was called the Book of the Holy Wars, and he never uses the term crusade.
Really?
Okay. So that's one thing. But I mean, those are, we can still say First Crusade and Second Crusade, etc. But they didn't call it that. So it wasn't like even what we call the Second Crusade. They were aware of the tradition and they talked about it, but they did not refer back to the first war, because to them crusading was just a continual religious activity like pilgrimages. There might be really big pilgrimages or really big crusading ventures at one time. And that's why we name them later. Historians later, well, we're going to call this one the first, this one the second, right? Gotcha. So it wasn't even like World War I and World War II. People during World War I were conscious of it was called the Great War, right? And then when the Second War started in 1939, I think the term World War II probably started pretty quickly. I'd have to look that up, but so that term is more of a modernist term, but that's fine. I was just explaining that, but just to get that out of the way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Cool.
So what we'll call the First Crusade, right? Urban II was the Pope. Now, one of the things that was going on there is there was actually a schism. There was another guy claiming to be Pope at the time. Mm-hmm. His name was Clement. He took the title Clement, and much of the European Christendom was divided at the time between allegiance to different ones. The popes had been at odds with the people known as the Holy Roman Emperors, which were really German kings. Mm-hmm. Had been at odds with them for at least 4 decades by that time, or something in that range. Also, the knightly culture was developing in the 11th and 12th century. A part of what will become chivalry is developing in this time. And the church, I think people really appreciate this. The church, the institution, bishops, archbishops, mostly, the first peace movement, if you want to call it that, and they literally called it the peace of God, had developed in France, really, what we would think of as France today. And they were trying to rein in violent activity. So at least making rules like you're not supposed to be attacking women and children, and you can't fight on certain days. Don't bring your weapons to church, these kind of rules. So this thing had been happening already. The difference with what we would call the crusade is then the church says that you shouldn't be fighting other Christians, but we will bless you fighting these other people, the Muslims, right? And you will not only are we saying like the government should do it to protect you, right? I think most people even today could conceive of, if you're attacked by a group, it's okay to defend yourself. I mean, you can debate all these, but I think most people accept that. Sure. So it wasn't just that, and they did think that. Like they made arguments like this is a defense against attack on us first. So I mean that's a big debate, but but the difference is, especially from a Protestant perspective, would be the difference is the church says not only that, but you will receive spiritual blessing by participating in this activity. And the idea of the indulgence really develops with the idea of crusading.
Okay.
Yes. Now, okay. And it's in the 12th century where that theology becomes more discussed by theologians and more they go into more particulars about this means that, this means that. But basically it was you go on this pilgrimage and that'll count for all the penance that you should be doing, right? And so it's like,
get your scales
right. and later they develop more specific differences. Like if you study the later period going into the Reformation, it's more spelled out. Like, well, the act of satisfaction you're doing, whether it's a crusade or a pilgrimage or whatever, only accounts for the temporal penalty, right? So they didn't really have those distinctions as much clear. It wasn't clear to people. It was just like, you're going to get these spiritual rewards. It'll count for the penance you should be doing. And if you think about it, a knight could have a lot of penance. What a knight to do.
So it's like, they weren't playing Parcheesi all
right.
day.
They're fighting each other constantly. And that's one of the things the church trying to like, stop doing this, right? Christian society shouldn't be this violent. So stop fighting each other and go fight. If you want to fight, we got somebody for you to fight, and you'll receive spiritual rewards for it. So that was the innovation, I think, of the use of spiritual reward as a motivator for fighting. And that was the innovation for what becomes crusading.
Interesting. And so it was not only this religious, obviously, component to it, but there also was a practical component.
Oh,
to it.
yes.
I mean, it wasn't hard to figure out. We Christians can't have our holy places being managed by Muslims. What the heck?
Yes,
they didn't call them Muslims, really, did they? Did they call them Muslims? Okay.
Well, Muslims is fine, but
okay.
If that they had been for a long time, the difference was, and I mean, Arab Muslims and the others that lived there were perfectly happy to have Christian pilgrims because of money, tourism. The same reason, whoever there, they're glad for you to show up there and spend money in Israel, or if you go to Nazareth or whatever, they're, if you can. But so that was part of it. But one of the things that changed in the 11th century was the invasion or migration of the Turks into the Middle East. The Turks were not Arab, different peoples that came from farther up in Central Asia, and they start migrating into the Middle East. And then eventually, that why we have Turkey today is because that's the group that settles that area eventually. And those Turks convert to Islam. And then they also conquered the Arab territories. So while they convert to Islam, they conquer a lot of the Arab territories. And then they start attacking the Eastern Roman Empire again, Byzantium. Byzantine Empire is what we often call it. But it was basically the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital in Constantinople. So they start the Turks restart this war against the Byzantines. And that was the impetus for the call for help. So the Emperor Alexius sends a letter to Urban and says, hey, there's basically they've taken over half of what we would call Turkey today, and they're threatening the rest of it. And so we need help. And so probably what he was hoping for were some mercenaries or some lords or some dukes or somebody to get the word, and they would come over with an army. But what he got was Urban and probably a team of his theologians and preachers come up with this idea of we're going to grant spiritual rewards to go on a pilgrimage. What the emperor did not ask for was he wasn't worried about a pilgrimage. It's Urban who combines these ideas and says, I want you to go and defend your fellow Christians from the attack, which he calls the cursed race of Persians, but he meant the Turks. They weren't clear about who was who yet, right? So and he gives this speech about, and the Turks had done things to certain people, and it depended on who it was, but like there's all these stories coming out about them torturing people, destroying holy places. But the main military issue was, are you going to help these Eastern Christians defend themselves, the Byzantine Empire? And they said yes. And so, but it wasn't just a few mercenaries. Urban calls it at Clermont, right, which we're talking about. They sent out the word at his council, and he says, the last day of the council, I'm going to give this sermon. And it's not just for the other clergy. I want anybody, like the nobles. And so basically he gives this speech. It was a sermon. And he proclaims basically the things I just said and says, and I don't know what the reaction was going to be, but he did appoint. We know that he sent out letters. He traveled around different places in Western Europe preaching himself. He also sent out letters to bishops and basically commissioned them to preach this same crusading venture. Okay. And so we know that. We don't have a lot about exactly. We have some stories of what they said in chronicles and such, but there's not like one document where you can say this is what he said.
I got
later.
Yeah.
But I think he underestimated the religious fervor and the spiritual. It was a revivalistic thing. There were preachers going around like John the Baptist or a Baptist revivalist in 1950, like a Billy Graham type thing, and they would have these big preaching, and then they would have like an altar call. Who's going to come up and take the cross for Jesus, right? And it just so happens a lot of people wanted to do it there, and so they amassed forces. There were probably like at some point 40 to 50,000 people in an army going east. And some of those were more organized by dukes and lords and, some church leaders, some bishops. But there were also whole groups of just what I would call rabble, led by kind of ne'er-do-wells and peasants, and a lot of them just marched east, didn't even know they were going. And a lot of them died along the way. Some of them made it to Constantinople. But they I think Urban underestimated at the time. He got a lot more than he asked for. Put it that way. And this happens in a lot of movements. Like the people that maybe started the French Revolution didn't think it would become.
Sure.
Right. And there's a political lesson in here. Like, you don't always control the movement you start. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And because it takes on a life of its own. So, and we see that with all kinds of events. But so, I mean, that's what happened with what we call the beginning of the First Crusade. Miraculously, militarily was what's miraculous in a way, and they thought it was miraculous. They actually march all the way to Jerusalem. A lot of people die on the way from various reasons, fighting, starvation, disease, but they actually take Jerusalem, and they establish what are called the Crusader states. Well, we call them Crusader states. These you have the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli, and these were established, and they were somewhat colonies in a way. A lot of the people that survived just went back home, and if you went back home, and a lot of them became like heroes, and some of them went around
Robin Hood or whatever.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's the
that's
the legend of it, right?
Right, yeah. So that's kind of the basics on what happens with the First Crusade and that period right there.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Matthew Phillips on the Center for Christian History website at centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College, in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook at the Center for Christian History, and on Instagram at Christ Hist Today. That's ChristHistToday. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.